Yeah, we do. Yes, that's a good point. We have our designated reader, so everyone else can just do shots. Okay, so chapter 3, Mishnah 1. We are in Moed Katan, chapter 3. Reminder again that Moed Katan is officially about the time between the start of a holiday and the finish of the holiday, the Chol HaMoed period, and the limitations that we put upon ourselves in order to make sure we have the maximum enjoyment of the holiday. And we're going to get to some topics at the end of this particular Mishnah that become immediately more relevant because they have to do with mourning, of what we do when somebody dies. And we're going to learn a lot of interesting points of halacha by the inverse. If you couldn't do it during Moed Katan, then you should be doing it when it isn't the festival. So it's going to give us a lot of information about how we do mourning in Judaism by when we couldn't do certain parts of mourning during the Chol HaMoed.
We saw something like that in Sukkot.
Yes, yeah, and we saw a little bit
when you couldn't, and with the weather, if
yes.
you can change.
And we saw a little bit before in Moed Katan as well, but we're going to get the whole second half of chapter 3 is all about death. Well, not about death, about mourning. Okay, but first let's get down to mundane things.
Okay, Mishnah 1. And these may shave during the festival.
All right, pause real quick. So fine print, shaving here doesn't mean getting out your razor and shaving, because that is prohibited every day, right? We don't use a blade on the face. That's just not allowed under Jewish law, right? The Torah prohibits shaving your face. However, shaving your face, meaning trimming your face growth, that is allowed on a regular day, but it is not allowed during the festival, during Chol HaMoed, right? So once the festival starts, we don't get the scissors out, right? So that when it says shaving, we're not talking about getting out your Bic razor. It's talking about trimming your beard, with the or scissors or whatever you use. Okay, and we'll go into shaving some other time in more detail, but that's where we're starting here. So don't misunderstand the word shaving.
And these are the people who may shave during the festival. One coming back from a trip abroad, or one coming out from a place of captivity, or coming out of prison, or one excommunicated whom the sages have released.
All right, so what's special about all of these these guys?
They didn't have the freedom to do what they wanted.
Right, they couldn't shave before. Right, so they were traveling, and so they couldn't shave. Right, it's not like nowadays you can have like your travel shave kit. I mean, no. they couldn't shave while they were traveling. Although I'll say when last time I took a long trip, I didn't bother trimming this while I was out. It's just let it grow. The one who's coming back from captivity, from prison, who could not, someone who is in cherem, who is in excommunication. Remember, in Jewish law, excommunication means no one's talking to you, no one's dealing with you. And during that time, you're supposed to be in mourning because the community is shunning you. Someone here?
I saw a car just coming.
Yeah, I think,
is that Yerach?
Probably Yerach.
Oh.
So during that time, you wouldn't shave either. Once that's done, now you can. The idea here is, of course, that for regular people who have freedom and who have the ability, you would shave right before the festival would begin. You'd want to look your best. So you'd trim up and be looking good.
I would,
with all due respect.
With all respect, I will give another spin on that.
Please.
Because for me, it's not more about freedom, it's about location. When you come back to the community, you shave.
Mm-hmm.
When you are far from the community, you don't shave. So if you're in captivity, okay, or you are in Keren, you are not part of the community.
True, but just traveling, if you're on a business trip or family pilgrimage.
But not only geographically, also spiritually. That's being.
I mean, yes, definitely. But for some people, they might travel, but not be away from the community. They just need to. It's how they make their livelihood. And so when they're traveling, they can't shave, and when they return, there is definitely a feeling of yes, okay, yeah, the door should be closed. If you can open it, that'd be great. Then that would be a good feeling. So yeah, there's definitely a feeling of being able to trim is usually considered a relief. I'm looking at people here, and I don't know how many times people here have had beards, but I'll tell you, sometimes, if I let this go too long, I'm dying to trim it up a little bit because it just doesn't feel comfortable, and it's looking shabby, and it needs to look nice. And especially right before holidays, I always try to give it a nice trim so that it looks, its best for the Chag. And that's what we're supposed to do. But some people don't have that opportunity or are not supposed to be shaving, which is what we're going to get to in the second part. There we are.
Because you don't want to look nice for your community, but what you're saying, what he said about it being a spiritual harmony, don't I still want to look nice even if I'm not in my community, if I'm out traveling? I want to look like a schlump? I think not. Do you think you also want to be neat?
Do we have the extra copy for him? I know we have.
I'll share one. Come on.
Wait, we should have more. You have two. There we go. I was going to say, I know that I made enough for how many people I thought would be here. Okay. So part 2 is going to give us a little bit of a different group.
Similarly, one who asked the sage to be released from a vow and was released, and a Nazirite or a leper on emerging from his state of impurity to his state of purification. All
right, so both a Nazirite as well as the Metzora, the person who is suffering from the condition, usually translates as leprosy, but isn't actually leprosy. I just always have to say that every time. The Nazirite or the Metzora, they can't shave. They're not allowed to shave during that period of time. Once they're done with that, they are supposed to shave. So if it finishes during the Chol Moed, during the festival, then absolutely they're allowed to shave. And similarly, someone who made a vow, in this case, a stupid vow, saying, I swear not to shave, blah, blah, blah. And then they're like, man, that was stupid. And they go to a sage and they couldn't find anybody to release them from their vow until during this festival. After they've been released, they're allowed to shave. So again, they couldn't do it before the festival began. So this was the first opportunity they had.
So when can you break a vow?
When it was stupid. No, when it was stupid. But you have to have a chacham, a sage, to help you do it. You can't just say it for yourself. Well, that gets a little more complicated in modern times. But in the ancient world, you were supposed to go to somebody who would help you analyze the vow in order to find where the problem was, in order to say, aha, see, that was where it was stupid. And because of that condition, you never would have made the vow if you'd been thinking clearly. Therefore, the vow is nullified because it was made by error.
But it has nothing to do with the vow being nullified during a festival. It doesn't have to be.
No, it's coincidental that it happens during the festival. If he could get it nullified before the festival, then no problem. But if he can only get it nullified during the festival, then he is still allowed to shave immediately afterwards. And there are reasons why it might be easier during a festival. Everybody's together in the city. It's easier to find a sage. If you live in some random little farm community, there may not be so many sages hanging around.
And they have a good mood.
The sages are supposed to be helpful all the time, even if they're not full of meat and wine.
I had this put another thought in my head, because I've always read that a woman's vow, if I make a vow, it can be nullified by my husband. I don't have to ask him, it can be nullified.
Day one.
Just on day one?
The moment he hears it, he has an opportunity. After that, it's
what
done.
If he doesn't know? I made it.
Yeah, if he doesn't know, he doesn't know. But as soon as he finds out.
The day he finds out. I never thought about what the guys do to nullify their vows.
With regards to things that are shared property.
Oh.
Things that are definitely your property are not. He has no control over that.
Oh.
Right. So the problem is that in the ancient world, the economic structure was that the head of the household usually owned all the property. Right. And therefore, if you were making a vow and a commitment, you would be making a commitment of the family property without the owner's consent. Now, as soon as he hears of it and doesn't object, then that vow becomes permanent and he can't nullify it later. But if it's your own property, then yeah, you're allowed to do with it as you choose. Just don't make stupid promises.
Yeah, right.
All right. Chapter 3, Mishnah 2.
These may launder their clothes during the festival. One coming back from a trip abroad, or one coming out from a place of captivity, or coming out of prison, or one excommunicated whom the sages have released.
Go ahead and read part 2 because it's going to be very familiar.
And similarly, one who asked a sage to be released from a vow and was released.
All right, so laundry, everybody's favorite chore, right? Washing your clothes. So I'm guessing if I were to ask everybody here, is that actually anybody's favorite job to do at home? No. Now get rid of your washing machine, right? And get rid of your dryer, right? Yeah, and realize that the clothes you have and the soap you have they don't work so well together, right? It's not an easy process at all. Laundry was work. I mean, like lots of work. I mean, like, real scrubbing on the rocks down by the river kind of work. So the sages really wanted to make sure that people had their clothes washed and ready to go before the festival began. You shouldn't be doing this kind of work during the festival if you can avoid it, because it was just too much trouble. Which is why these group of people who didn't have the option, you're traveling, you're living out of your suitcase, you're not going down to the river and doing that. And the people who were in prison, the people who were excommunicated, all the same people we talked about in the last Mishnah, not so easy. So for them, they were allowed to do laundry. For the rest of us, no, do laundry before the festival begins. Make sense? Okay. But there's an exception, or a set of exceptions.
Hand towels, barber's towels, and bath towels may be laundered.
All right. Those were able to be laundered because...
Health issues?
What's that?
Health issues?
Well, kind of, and they were daily use, right? This is just the kind of thing that you would constantly be using, which, yeah, hygiene, yay, Jews. We were good with hygiene for most of our history, often better than our surrounding cultures. Not perfect by modern standards. Don't get me wrong. I mean, if you see the way their pots looked back there, you wouldn't care about kashrut. You'd just go, I'm not eating from that pot.
At least they wash their hands before each meal.
Without soap. But yes, there was better than nothing. It was definitely better than nothing. And certain things were just expected to be washed regularly. And so those things that were expected to be washed regularly and which were not as hard to wash regularly and needed to be washed regularly, those were allowed to be washed during the festival. So that set is fine. And we're going to see something a little bit similar in part 4.
Zavim and Zavot, menstruants, and women who have given birth, and anyone going from a state of purity to impurity are permitted to launder their clothes.
Right. So again, Zavim and Zavot, these are people with uncharacteristic discharges, right? That genitive organ is leaking in a way that is not normal. Right? Not the regular usage. That is a problem. And that needs, now you're ritually impure, and therefore you need to wash your clothes and all of that when you come back. Same thing if you are Nida during the monthly cycle and the other issues that are mentioned here as well. So for that, yes, we also allowed laundry to be done. But number 5.
Everyone else is prohibited.
But for the rest of us, do your laundry first. Right?
Plan ahead.
So much of what we've learned in Moed Katan is telling us, plan ahead for the festival. Plan ahead for the festival. The festival comes, you're supposed to enjoy it. And if you haven't planned ahead, then you're not going to enjoy it. And by setting up these prohibitions during the festival, it is meant not to make our life hard during the festival, but to push the hard before the festival, so the holiday is actually a holiday. Right? I mean, think about the last vacation you took where maybe you made your vacation a staycation, and all you did were chores around the house during your time off. Not much of a vacation, right? That it may have been necessary, you may have needed to get things done, but it didn't probably make you feel as good as if you had just relaxed. It didn't mean you had to go somewhere, but you could have just sat on the sofa reading a good book, and it would have been nicer than fixing the shingles on the roof or redoing the planter out in the backyard. Sometimes you need to actually have downtime. And God wanted to make sure that during the festivals, we had that time to be with God and with our community. And if we were doing all of this work, then we weren't going to have that time. And if we weren't ordered not to do the work, we would have done it. Right? That's how humans are. We often will fill up our time with activity, even when that time is supposed to be relaxing, because we're not actually lazy. That's kind of the weird thing about human nature. Is most humans are not inherently lazy. I know we all think that someone else is lazy, but really, most people are not lazy. And they will always do more work if they have the opportunity. And that's why the Torah and the sages had to say, whoa, stop. Right? It wasn't the 6 days you shall work that was the hard commandment. It was the 1 day you will rest that was the hard commandment. And it's still hard for a lot of people.
But I can still serve lunch and dinner to the 10 people who are at my house and clear up the table, but I'm not going to wash the dishes.
Well, but that's part of the celebration. right? If you don't
I didn't
eat,
realize.
right? If you don't eat, you're not going to have a celebration.
So you'll be serving it next time, and I'll just sit and relax. Okay.
You know, actually, yeah, in my household, we have a division of labor. Right? So we do try to share the burden, and each one of us does the part that we each enjoy more than the thing we would enjoy less. Right? So, you know, it's, you know, if I made Penelope do all the things I do during Pesach, she would be very cross with me. And
Yes.
if I had to do all the things she does during Pesach, no one would ever eat. So, well, they might eat the first bite, but they probably wouldn't have a second. So it works out pretty well. But you're right, there has to be a division of the preparation labor.
Because there still is labor involved, but we take away the unnecessary ones, the ones that you really
Correct.
do without.
Exactly
So
right.
maybe a little less.
All right, and that's why, because festivals were much longer and more involved, we were given permission to do cooking on the festival, but only for the festival, right? You can't make 12 loaves of bread that you're going to eat for the next month. You can only eat, well, you only make what you're going to eat. All right, chapter 3, Mishnah 3.
They may write the following documents during the festival.
All right, so pause real quick, flip it on its head. Except for the following documents, you may not write on a festival. Now, what kind of writing is being described here? They're talking about actual document writing. Right? It's not like Shabbat, where, you know, just making 2 letters is transgressing. They're talking about actually writing meaningful documents. And writing back then was not easy. I mean, most people kind of were sort of literate. They could usually, many of the Jews could read. Not all of them were expert writers. Most of them definitely were not able to know what to write for anything that was official, right? For any kind of important document. That was a specialized skill. And nowadays, you know, we'd call that person a lawyer, you know, who's able to write important documents. But, you know, if you want to write a will, if you want to write a marriage contract, most of us, I imagine today, wouldn't write that ourselves. We're going to see there are some exceptions, however, to things like I just mentioned that you do get to write during a festival, and we'll talk about why. So what can you write?
Betrothal of women, that kind of document. Divorce documents and receipts. The wills of the dying person. Bequest and prosbol.
So prosbol, I have to explain real quick as we go through. Prosbol is where you would write a document that would transfer the loan to the court so that it could still be collected after the sabbatical year. Very controversial, very complicated process. The idea was, in order to ensure that loans would still be given to the poor, this process was created.
Yes.
Isn't that against the Torah?
Yes, it's a loophole, right? It's basically a loophole, and this comes from Hillel, where he saw that people were saying, I'm not going to help anybody because the sabbatical year is coming and my debts are going to be canceled. So
money, and then you don't have to pay it back because it's a sabbatical year. I'm not going to lend it.
Right, and it's not a question of necessarily the people being mean or greedy or selfish. It's, you know, let's imagine that I've got $200 and you need $100. I can't give you $100, but I don't need that extra $100 until the spring for some farming equipment. I can loan you the $100 between now and then. But if I know that money's going to disappear because of the sabbatical, then no, I can't, because I just can't afford it. It would destroy me. And so I can't help you, and now you get no help. And that's not good for you either. And so this was set up to ensure that there could be a humane way that some debts could be carried over if they went through the proper procedure to make sure that they were being done for this purpose, not, you know, just because they wanted to squeeze people. And the idea was never about loan sharking. Remember, all of the debts that were being done here, these are interest-free. No one is making a buck off of any of this. It's just about making sure that the lender can get back the money that he actually needs, and that he will therefore give it to the person who's in need at the time. We're not talking about like business loan kind of things.
Now you can prepare an advanced marriage document and use of divorce. Like if we are talking about laundry, this is the same.
In the modern world. So I don't know if it's still the same way, but when I was in Israel, we got an invitation to a bar mitzvah 2 weeks before the bar mitzvah. And that was just, they said, oh, you know, our son's having a bar mitzvah, and, you know, he's going to be called to the Torah. That's no big deal. We're going to have a party at the house afterwards and all of that. It was just very low key. And there was they didn't rent a hall. They didn't have a DJ. They weren't worried about the balloons and the caterer and all of that stuff. And so, yeah, doing it 2 weeks notice is no problem. Marriage as well. You meet the right person, the family makes the right deal, especially during the Chag. Maybe you're in Jerusalem all together, and now you're going to go back and prepare for the wedding. Because remember, betrothal doesn't mean actually married. It means you're agreeing you're going to get married. You have to do it now, or else you miss the opportunity. So these kinds of agreements we think of as needing months and months and months and months of planning and preparation. For them, yeah, okay, we're fine.
So 1 week, you can postpone your wedding or your divorce for 1 week.
So I can definitely tell you that for people that are really very much interested in getting divorced, telling them to postpone it a week is not going to make you a popular man.
How was the joke that you said about the rabbinical students?
Well, yes, but why would you delay, right? We're not breaking halakha by writing the document now, right? We are helping them to take care of a mitzvah to get married, a mitzvah if it's the necessary step to be divorced, right? And therefore we don't delay it if it's necessary. Remember, we're not talking about writing this on Shabbat.
And receipt means of your food.
No. The receipt for the get. The get was delivered, and you get a receipt that the get was delivered.
That receipt.
Yes, that receipt. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, we're not talking about writing out a receipt, you bought 5 chickens.
Yeah.
No.
Okay.
No, because remember, you get a patur from, you don't actually keep your get. You get a patur. You get a document that says the get was written, the get was delivered, the get is now no longer available. Okay. But here's your document that says all that just happened. Because if you don't have that, then it gets complicated. And if you keep the get around, then people keep checking the get, and then someone's going to eventually say, well, there should be a comma. There's no real commas, but some kind of niggling little argument, and now people are arguing about whether the get was really valid, and the woman might already be remarried, and now you're saying the children from the second marriage are actually mamzeri. So you write the receipt, and you get rid of the get. And that way no one can ever cast doubt on it again. So that's why the receipt was so important. The wills of someone dying, obviously you can tell. The bequests, again, the gifts of someone who is sick and dying. Prosables, as we mentioned, because they're in need, they need to be taken care of. Keep going.
Evaluation certificates and orders for support, documents of chalitza and the repudiation of marriage and arbitration records, decrees of the court, and correspondence.
Okay, so the text you have here gives the full version of what all of these are, but just to run through the short version. Evaluation certificates were needed in order to attain how much collateral a person had, how much property they were worth in order to be able to give them a loan. And again, as we talked about, loans were need-based for the majority here, so you need to know what the collateral is before you can give a loan. Orders for support, this is the money that you need to pay to a widow. Again, she needs it or else she's in trouble. Documents of chalitza. The chalitza was when the woman was supposed to marry the brother because there were no children, but instead she's done a service because he said no, and you need to make a document that says that she did that, so now she's free to marry someone else. Repudiation, that means a young boy or girl was said they were going to, their parents said they were going to marry someone else, and now that they are old enough to make the decision for themselves, they've said no, right? Because they were always allowed. Make sure you guys met Fiddler on the Roof, total lie, right? Not a lie culturally.
Which part? But
Yeah,
who decides they're going to marry? The papa,
that's right.
until she becomes more than bat mitzvah age, in which case she can tell her father, no, I don't want to marry the guy you picked out. I don't want to marry Laser Wolf, the old butcher, right?
but this is the promise to get married, not a consummated marriage.
Exactly right. This is the promise, right? So the father can do that whole betrothal document on behalf of his little girl or son, and when they reach age, they're allowed to say, I don't want to, right? And then therefore that marriage is canceled, and you need to make a formal document that says they're not getting married.
You need to do this urgently in that week. You cannot wait 3 days.
Have you ever had a teenager?
Yeah. 200.
Yeah. So no, they didn't want to make sure, they wanted to make sure that this kind of thing was not put off. the rabbis were very concerned that if you put things like this off, then mistakes can happen. People can continue in a certain way, and eventually you've got real problems that can't be unfixed.
Well, the other thing is the guy could be insisting that he marry. Let's get married during the festival. I want to get married right now, and she doesn't want to.
Well, we don't get married during the festival.
That's right.
That was in the last couple chapters.
That's right. She can't get married during the festival.
So there's a lot of weeks during the calendar that she can't get married.
Yeah, but with that, in that way, with that thought, there's a lot of things that you can say under that category of urgency. I work for 3 weeks for you. I really need the money to enjoy the holiday and to buy, and you need to pay me during the holiday.
Well, no, you did have to pay them before the holiday, absolutely.
No, during the holiday.
So
because if you have the same logic, if you follow the same logic until the end, also you can do that. So there's no end.
There is an end, right? So one of the reasons why they write a list is to say this is the end, right? These things, yes. Other things, no. That's one reason why they give a list. But there are certain other issues. Yes. So if somebody was, for example, a worker and they weren't able to get their money, then that would be a big issue. And they would have gone to the Beit Din before the festival began. And the Beit Din would have forced the employer to pay if he had the money at all. There's actually a very famous story about that, we'll talk about that story another time, about a worker who had to wait the whole festival without getting paid, and eventually did get paid, and it turned out to be entirely an innocent reason why the employer hadn't paid. Right? It's a great example of kaf zachut, of the side of merit, of assuming that the reason you're being stiffed is because the guy can't pay you, not because he doesn't want to pay you.
So they cannot be paid.
Generally speaking, no. I can't think of exceptions off the top of my head. That one I don't have 100% certainty, but generally speaking, no. But if you absolutely needed to, then perhaps yes. I mean,
so why you cannot marry during the holidays?
Remember, that was because of the joy, right? The joy of the festival needs to be the joy of the festival, not the joy of getting married. Unless you're remarrying your old wife, in which case it's not so much fun.
So need to be what? So that creates a contradiction. So the shortfall of the divorce more important than the shortfall of the holiday.
No, the making sure the mitzvah happens is more important than putting it off in case it doesn't. Right. So these are precautionary things.
But if you don't have the divorce on those festivals, you're not going to enjoy it either. You're not going to enjoy it.
For some people, getting divorced,
be a little bit soft.
Yeah, but for some people, getting divorced is almost as much fun as getting married. So we can't say categorically, but we definitely know that preventing a divorce that needs to happen and over delaying it, that's an issue. And that's what the rabbis are trying to stop here. Similarly, the arbitration records, this is going to be another controversial one I can see by this class tonight, is you would have court cases where you had to pick your judges. And the 2 litigants would have to choose who the judges were going to be. As you can imagine, sometimes it's hard to get people to agree on that, right? I mean, we as a nation, we can barely decide who our courts should be. Imagine if you were actually, you hit my car, no, I didn't. Well, we have to go to court. You pick a judge, I pick a judge, and we have to agree on this? Yeah, okay, but if we do agree, write it down. Because once we get the agreement, we're going to seal that so that we can make sure the trial actually happens after the festival, and we know that we've got an agreement. So that was allowed to be written down. Similarly, if the court actually makes a ruling and has to issue a decree, that can be done, again, so it isn't lost. And correspondence. This one is a little more complicated. There's different interpretations in the halakha. Some say that this meant any letters to people, because letters were rare, right? We didn't have email, we didn't have text messaging, we didn't even have the U.S. Postal Service. What's that?
No junk mail.
No junk mail, no WhatsApp, nothing of that,
No
right?
spam.
Definitely no spam, because it's not kosher. It's ham. So the idea that you'd be able to write to friends was considered acceptable by many authorities. Later on, however, the idea became that writing to friends was actually kind of easy nowadays, once we got into a paper society and that kind of thing, and it was easy to find a postal service. It wasn't like you just say, hey, I hear you're going to Tel Aviv. Can you take this? Well, there was no Tel Aviv in the time of the rabbis,
Yes.
but you know the point.
Jaffa.
Jaffa back then, yeah. You're going to Yavne, here, take this. that was how postal services worked in the ancient world. You didn't have like postal runners unless you were the government. Later on, because postal services became more common, the halakha sort of began to be argued that this was talking about regular friend writing, no, but writing to the government, yes. That the official correspondence that was needed for the community or needed because of problems with the government, who, you know, back then the government could be bad, that was allowed.
What about you? Someone is going to some place and ask, that community ask you for a tshuva as a rabbi.
Right.
But if you write the tshuva, you are working because it's your work as a rabbi.
Right. But
and you are not in Shadikoli. However, it's very important.
So that was considered to be, I believe, under the category of decisions. Right? That if you're making an important decision that needs to be done, then yes.
So yes, you are right.
Yes.
And these decisions can be made during the intermediate days of the festival, is that right?
Yeah, rabbis don't really get that time off.
They don't get that time off.
Because oftentimes this was the only time people could come to the rabbis. You remember we talked about nullifying the vows. You didn't have a chance to find a hacham all the time. Sometimes this was the best chance for people to be able to come and bring their cases or bring their questions. So yeah, it's not always relaxing for the rabbi during a festival. It's goes with the territory. That's part of being a teacher, right? When school's open and the students are there, you don't relax. You can relax once they're home. Well, maybe, then you're grading their papers, right? All right, chapter 3, Mishnah 4, a little more writing.
They may not write loan documents during the festival, but if the creditor does not trust him or he does not have food to eat, he may write. Again,
general principle, no, we're not doing loans. But if we're not going to be able to get the loan to happen without the document, you know, he was not going to let go of the money until it's written out, then yes, and especially if the guy doesn't have enough money to buy food, then by all means, do the loan, write it out, make sure the guy can eat. Part 2 has been a surprise, I imagine.
They may not write Torah scrolls, tefillin, and mezuzot during the festival, nor may they correct even a single letter, even in the ancient temple scroll.
All right, so the temple scroll was the Uber scroll, the master scroll, the one that they were using to copy all the other scrolls out of, just in case you were wondering what that meant. So,
where did have they, I mean, I'm not sure, but is it still existing? Is it still...
Yeah, the one we've got in there.
Okay.
No, I mean, that's the thing, is that the temple scroll was never permanent because it's still made out of the cloth, the animal hide, the skin. Pick one word, not two. The hide, the skin. So it's made out of that, and so that's always eventually going to fall apart. So they would copy it into a new one, and then copy that into a new one. But back in the days of the Beit HaMikdash, there was one copy that everybody could officially check on. Nowadays, we don't have a single copy for everyone, but all of our copies are copied from another Torah, so that chain does continue all the way back.
I read that the Torah that we are copying is one from, I think, from France. That after the second temple were destroyed and they found one that was a perfect one. I think it was Rambam or one at the time that went to France, especially, and they copied that Torah that was the most perfect one. And all the copies came from there.
The history of the Sefer Torah that we have is complicated, and one that we should get into as a whole separate class, because it can be very easily misunderstood. The official version of the Torah that we have that is agreed upon and shared upon is indeed only a little more than 1,000 years old. And that's complicated for people because it makes it sound like we didn't have one Torah. We did, and we didn't. And how that is both true is the subject of a whole nother class. So that's a can of worms that, without doing a whole class on it, I don't want to open right now. But you're right. The basic thing you're remembering is correct.
So maybe this is the next class.
I don't know. We could take a break and go into the tradition of the Torah scroll writing and what our sages have said about that. But yeah, we would have to talk about that. Yeah. See.
But that's really work. Writing a Torah scroll of tefillin is
okay.
Really work.
So this is very much a professional job, and that's why it's prohibited, right? You don't just write your own mezuzah off the cuff. However, as we're going to see, Rabbi Yehuda argues, sure, some people do, and that's okay.
Yeah, because if you are someone that came to the holidays, okay, from far, and you need a sage, and you don't have a sage every day, and your mezuzah on the Sefer Torah is mekukeret, and you need someone that will repair it, and you have the sage there, that is the same category that we saw before. So they should allow in these cases.
Therefore, you should check your mezuzah
Before.
because if you live far from anything else, you don't have any sage around you, and you go to Jerusalem for the holidays, and you see there the sages, that's the opportunity that you have to repair the mezuzah that you don't have in where you live.
But it's unfair to make the sage work hard during the festival in this way. That's a really unfair thing to do.
But they work to document all the things.
No, they don't. It says they don't like
So, Natan, you're actually hitting on a very good and important point that will show a very important distinction. What was everything in common with everything you could write compared to this? And everything else that you were allowed to write was something that was desperately needed for that person's life, right? The mezuzah and tefillin, as much as they are desperately needed for us most of the time, right? I'm not going to starve to death without a mezuzah, right? I've got 30 days to put a mezuzah up when I move into a new place, right? And I have time to get a new set of tefillin if for some reason my tefillin, were stolen or something, and I am allowed not to have them, and especially during the festival when we don't wear tefillin, at least depending upon which custom you come from. So the idea that these things, no, we're going to wait on them compared to the others, there was an urgency that wasn't just I want it and I should have it because it's a private mitzvah, but it is, the others were all urgencies of that affected your goof and your ability to function as a normal person. Am I going to be married to this person or not? Am I going to be divorced or not? Am I going to be able to have my court case or not? That those are things that I really, really, really need decided. Whether I'm going to get a new mezuzah, that I can wait another 6 days for. Which is the maximum that a person would have been waiting at this point. You can always tell the sage, I want a mezuzah, so as soon as Chol Moed is over, get working. Well, but Rabbi Yehuda has a different option.
Yeah, Rabbi Yehuda says a man may write tefillin and mezuzot for himself.
Right. So technically, you don't need a hacham to do this. Right now, you do want to get it right, and it is kind of a. Come on, if you try, I'm sure you could do fine. You need a piece of cloth like this, right? 'Cause writing that small is the hard part. But
you look like you're grieving.
And also, the idea would then be
one may spin on his thigh the blue wool for his fringe.
Right. So again, this is a mitzvah. Now, spinning generally we don't allow. What's being done here? Because he's doing it with a shinui. He's doing it in a different way. Normally, you use a whole spinning wheel. This is spinning by pulling it, by rolling it across your thigh. You're spinning the fibers together, but you're not doing it in the normal way. So if it was an emergency because your techelet was, broken, you needed to replace your tzitzit, yes, but you had to do it in a different way than you normally would do it. Make sense? All right. Pressing on. 5.
Mishnah 5.
All right. Now we get to death.
One who buries.
Hold on a second. Before we start, I just want to make sure that we're all clear on the times. Shiva. Right? How long is Shiva?
7 days. More or less.
No. 7 days. Right? We'll get to the more or less. Well, there's never more. We'll get to the less when we get to some special categories here.
You don't stop with Shabbat?
No. So we're going to talk about that in just a second. Right?
Count,
So,
but you don't.
okay. So then there is count versus observe. And observe is always talking, in this case, about public, because for private, you always observe Shiva, even on Shabbat. Right? The public forms of Shiva on Shabbat are suspended, but the private forms of Shiva are not. Right? So you don't go and listen to live music on Shabbat just because it's Shabbat. On Shabbat, you're still in Shiva, even if in public, you're not acting like Shiva. That's why you go to synagogue on Shabbat during Shiva rather than staying home. All right. So Shiva is the 7 days after the funeral. which should be as close to the day of death as possible, but it's 7 from the funeral. And then Shloshim is 30 days from the funeral. And during that 30 days period, there are continued restrictions. And those are the main things that we're going to talk about here, is Shiva and Shloshim. For parents, there's the full year, but the main thrust of this is going to be on Shiva and Shloshim.
Full year or 11?
11 months.
Okay.
The tradition of saying Kaddish has been abridged to 11 months in most communities. However, the observance of mourning, of Avelut, is still 12 months. Right? You do not go to your rock concert in the middle of the 11th month, before the first yahrzeit. You can stop saying Kaddish during that 11th month, but the other forms, which are the older forms of mourning, we still observe all the way through the full year.
I thought that was only for evil people who needed a full year.
Kaddish.
Kaddish is.
Right. So the idea of Kaddish, which again is a whole nother class by itself.
Yeah.
The idea of Kaddish as a way of bringing spiritual benefit to the soul of the deceased, that is the rationale behind not doing a full 12 months, because only somebody who was totally evil would need a full 12 months. My parents aren't totally evil, therefore I'll give them only 11 months. Right? That was the method for Kaddish, but that does not apply to all the other forms of mourning, because you're still sad that they're dead. Right? You may not want to impugn their character, but that doesn't mean your sadness goes away. So you're still mourning. You're just not saying Kaddish during that final month. But yes, for so many people, Kaddish has become almost the only way that they mourn during that whole year, that once that 11th month comes around, it's almost like their mourning stops. But no, that is not what the halacha is. The mourning continues for the full year. Okay, so now that we've got that basic idea down, we are going to encounter another issue, teaching moment, which is the halacha that we see in this is not precisely the halacha as it is interpreted by the Talmud and the Gemara, and not exactly what we do today. So I'm going to point out where the differences are. Okay, so just be prepared for that.
First, one who buries his dead 3 days before a festival, the decrees of Shiva are annulled from him.
Okay, so we're going to need a timeline. So this is the burial. And that's the same color. And this is Chag. That's a G. Right? That's the festival. If there is 1, 2, 3, right? That's 4. Well, we'll just do it like that. 1, 2, 3. If there are 3 days before the festival, which means it should be 4, 5, 6, 7, Shiva stops. You only observe the 3. And after the festival is over, no more. There's no additional days of Shiva.
Even Moed Katan, you don't see Shiva.
No, you definitely, if the person dies during Chol Moed, it's a different topic. But if you had the period before the festival, then during the festival and after the festival, there's nothing else added, right?
It's very difficult. My aunt died 3 days before Rosh Hashanah. Oy.
We're going to talk about Rosh Hashanah in just a second, so hold on to that thought. But this 3 days, this is what the Mishnah says. The Gemara says 1 hour. If you sit for 1 hour before a festival, Shiva is done, right? So if you bury somebody that literally the afternoon of, let's find the one that's not controversial, the afternoon of Sukkot, right? So it is Sukkot afternoon, and it is 4 o'clock, and you bury the person, you go home, you are there for an hour, and people come and they say Hamakom, right? They give you condolences, and then it is time for Sukkot to begin. You get up, you light the candles, you say the Shehechianu, you do the Kiddush, right? You go to services, Shiva is over.
What about Shabbat?
What about Shabbat? We're going to come back to Shabbat, yes, in this Mishnah. So we're just getting there.
But that is so difficult.
So this is the Mishnah said you needed 3 days, because the Mishnah overall and the Gemara and Halacha pick up on this as well, which say if a mourner has to, for example, go back to work because they can't afford to take 7 days off from work. Because remember, during Shiva, you're at home. You're not going out at all except for Shabbat to go to services. The sages did say, sit Shiva at least 3 days. And then if you have to do some work privately at home, that's okay, right? It's still better to have the full 7 days. But if you're going to starve, if you do that, then there are ways to sort of mitigate that. So they always felt that the first 3 days were the most important. And that's why in the Mishnah they said this. But the Gemara says, yeah, but once the festival comes, if you even only had an hour, it's done, right? There's no way to continue Shiva, and there's no way to continue Shiva on the other side. At least that's what we're going to get to. Let's go ahead and keep getting a little bit more of the Mishnah down.
One who buries his dead 8 days before a festival, the decrees of the Shloshim, the 30 days, are annulled from him.
All right, so why 8 days? Because you would have 1 through 8, right? Exactly, it's Shiva plus 1. Right, so if you have Shiva plus 1 and then the Chag, right, then you did Shiva, and then right after Shiva, it becomes Sukkot. Shloshim is done, right? So you can get a haircut, you can, go out and re-enter society more nicely, you can wear nicer clothes again. Shloshim is over, even though you only sat for 8 days rather than 30.
Why? Doesn't make sense. You can count the 30 after the
Chag. Right. The festival mood, you're not allowed to, as we're going to see in really very striking terms, you're not allowed to make yourself sad during the festival.
You have to be happy.
You have to at least give yourself the opportunity to be happy. Right. Now, this doesn't mean you have to walk around going, and pretending to be happy, but you're not allowed to do the things that make you unhappy. Right. And that's the thing that a lot of people miss, is that Shiva and Shloshim are supposed to make you unhappier, right? They are supposed to make you do things that will make you miserable. And that way you can actually grieve. You can be mournful. You can be sad. Because so many people run away from being sad. But that means that all the things that we do on Shiva and Shloshim don't fit with the mood of the Chag, right? Because if I do all the things I'm supposed to do on Shiva or Shloshim, or if I don't do the things I'm supposed to not do during Shiva and Shloshim, then the festival will be miserable because they're designed to make me miserable. So the festival has to cancel them. And then the question becomes, why can't I reboot it?
Yeah,
right.
Wow.
Right. Why can't we just continue? Because indeed, let's do part 3.
But I find what the Shiva does, you are miserable. Your parent just died. You're not happy. And this helps you get through it. It helps you not try to pretend to be happy while inside you're really suffering.
Exactly.
Psychologically, it's much better to be able to admit to people that you're really sad rather than cutting it short. I understand why they do it. It's a holiday, but wow.
Wow,
It's
indeed.
difficult. Especially you tell me it's 1 hour and then you have to forget it. I remember when my father died, I was so surprised the next day when the sun came up. I thought the world was going to end.
Right.
I was a teenager. And so the sadness, but being able to express it through Shiva week and have people sit with you and say, of course you're sad.
Hold on. What happens?
People sat with us.
Okay.
Oh, yes.
What happened to their festival? Right? So part of the difficulty, and the Talmud goes into this in more detail, part of the difficulty of continuing Shiva during Chag is you are dragging the whole community in with you. And because the Gemara can't imagine that you'd be sitting Shiva and everyone else would be off partying.
Oh, yeah,
right? No, you're a community. You're an extended family. Everyone's going to be there with you. And now the entire Chag for the entire community has been shattered. So as much as we may think, I'm never going to be happy and I need this time, yeah, but they can't give it to you right then. And if you continue, they will want to, right? And that is a horrible tension for a community to be in.
But also because of the festival, you are now with community in a different way.
In a different way, yes. But you're definitely not alone.
Not sitting alone.
Right.
Right.
Which if you were continuing Shiva and they were ignoring you, might be even worse. All right, but let's do part 3 because it's going to give us another important topic.
Because the sages said that Shabbat counts but does not interrupt, while festivals interrupt and do not count.
Okay, so what they say is that on Shabbat, which I believe, Natan, you brought up, right? On Shabbat, it counts as part of the count, right? So 1, 2, 3, Shabbat, 5, 6, 7, right? It still counts as part of the 7, but during it, we're not observing the observances of Shiva or Shloshim. Whereas the festivals, if there wasn't enough, this is again Mishnah, but not what we do today or in the Gemara. If there wasn't enough, you would skip the rest of the festival and you would reboot. But by the Gemara and definitely by later halacha, we don't. It cancels and it's permanently canceled, done. This is a change from the later halacha.
So today we
No, we do not.
Oh,
We do not. No, the Mishnah seems to have an idea that there was a reboot, but even by the time of the Talmud, we were not rebooting after the festival. Done and done. Which, let me give you worst case. Well, I can't give that to you yet because we haven't talked about it. Okay, when we finish chapter 6, I'll give you the worst case scenario.
Okay. Rabbi Eliezer says, from the time the temple was destroyed, Atzeret, Shavuot, is like Shabbat.
So Atzeret was the Mishnaic term for Shavuot, and yeah, Shmini Atzeret gets a little confusing.
Yeah.
The idea was this was the great gathering for the Torah. And in his opinion, which fails, so don't memorize this, but in his opinion, Shavuot shouldn't count as being a Chag. And therefore, when Shavuot happens, it doesn't matter, you just keep sitting Shiva. Right? Now, what is also special about Shavuot? Only one day. It's like Shabbat, right? There's no Chol Moed. So Pesach, yeah, we have a whole week. Sukkot, yeah, we have a whole week. Shavuot, blink and you miss it. It's just like Shabbat. So in his opinion, Shavuot should not count for canceling out Shloshim and Shiva. However, however, he loses, right? The halacha is definitely that we do count Shavuot as a full Chag, and it does stop Shiva or Shloshim depending upon where you are. Stop.
So the previous one says Shabbat is counted and does not interrupt. Means that after Shabbat you continue your Shiva?
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Part 2.
Rabban Gamliel says, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like festivals.
All right, so Rabban Gamliel said, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, even though they are not technically Chagim, right? They are not one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Even though they're not, they should count like festivals. However,
the sages say the rule is not according to the words of this one or that one. Rather, Atzeret is like the festivals, and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like Shabbat.
All right, so the sages say that Shavuot is indeed a Chag, which is still the halacha that we now practice. However, we also practice now that Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur are like Chagim, right? So that halacha eventually evolves that if somebody dies right before Rosh Hashanah stops it. And if someone dies right before for Yom Kippur, it stops it.
Why change?
Because they have the feel of the festivals for us now. So it was, again, just came to be considered to be natural to have that stoppage that happens, which brings me to the worst case scenario, which is somebody who dies 1 hour before Yom Kippur. Right? They die 1 hour before Yom Kippur, Shiva is over. Or not die, but they're buried 1 hour before Yom Kippur. So Shiva is over with Yom Kippur.
But you have Kornid,
2 hours.
2 hours.
Yeah, you sit for Shiva 1 hour on the afternoon of Yom Kippur, or before Yom Kippur begins, right? Then you get up, you go to Kol Nidre, you do your service, Shiva's over. Shloshim finishes 5 days later on Sukkot, right? Because Shiva is done, so after Yom Kippur is over, Shloshim begins. 5 days later, Sukkot comes along, it finishes off Shloshim. Right, that's the worst case scenario for somebody to not have the time to be able to go through the full mourning process as Judaism wants a person to go through.
To know how to live and how to die.
Mm-hmm.
I need to make sure you schedule when you die with lots of empty room, no holidays.
Isn't that why you said that Judaism is all about that?
Yes, which is what's going to make the next few chapters difficult. especially in the modern world. There's a lot of controversy about this up to this point. So, Mishnah 7.
They do not rend their clothes or bare their shoulders or provide a meal for the mourners except for the relatives of the dead.
Right, so this is during Chol Moed. This is not before the festival. This is during. So somebody dies during the festival, right? We have to bury them because we can't just leave the body waiting for 7 days. Right, so we bury them. We don't tear kriya, right? In the old world, they would bare a shoulder. That was another sign of mourning that had to do with, like, tunics and togas and all of that. And the community doesn't have to bring the meal that would come to help feed the mourners, right? All of that, none of that's happening, right? And except for the relatives of the dead, meaning the immediate family of the dead, they could support one another. But the rest of the community, no, they're not around, right? Because they're in the festival. It's not reasonable to expect them to be dropping the rest of the festival to come to you.
But you didn't say to her that it's terrible if something like that happens.
I know it's terrible. And that's why I said this is hard, right? Because how do you handle this, right? It's they're dead, and I'm mourning, but no one else is allowed to come and mourn with me. And I'm not allowed to mourn completely either. It's heartbreaking, but without it, the festival would be trampled. And so there is a horrible, horrible tension here.
So still is like that at heart.
Let's finish it off and then we'll talk about it.
And they do not provide a meal except on an upright couch.
Right. Normally you would sit on the floor or you'd sit on a low stool.
That's right.
And during this, no, the meal that we eat is eaten on a regular chair, right? We're not doing the things that make us miserable, even though we're miserable.
They do not bring food to the house of mourning on an ornamental tray, a salver, or a flat basket, but just in plain baskets.
Right. Normally you make a big deal about bringing to the people to show the support, to show how much you care. Nope. This is just basic food, right? Here it comes. No fancy delivery.
And they do not say the mourner's benediction during the festival.
Right? Hamakom Yenachem, or the other phrases from other communities, that greeting is not offered during this time. It's hard.
Yeah, but they may stand in a row and comfort the mourners, and the mourners may formally dismiss the community.
But when they return from the graveyard, the community can stand, as you've probably seen if you've ever been to a funeral, where they have rows of the supporters there. They can stand, and the mourners can pass. They can offer some consolation, and the mourner can formally say, "Thank you for being here. You're free to go," kind of thing. That much was allowed.
But that's not destroy the happiness of the community.
No.
Standing in a row.
That's the compromise that the sages are making.
The hour of the funeral. I mean, the funeral isn't a happy time either. But the hour of the funeral, and then when the mourners leave, they stand in a row. You walk between them, and then the festival begins. At least for a short. It's sort of like a compromise.
Let's finish up a few more pieces because all of this is going to come back to that question that Natan asked. So what do we do today? So let's do Mishnah 8 as well.
They do not place the bier on the throughway during the festival, so as not to encourage eulogizing.
So what would usually happen is you would, of course, be carrying the person to the cemetery, right? Didn't have, fancy hearses and things like that. And the person would just be lying on top with a cloth over the top of them, right? That was the way a person was prepared for the funeral. And you would stop at the crossroads. Right? You would stop in the most public area in your village, and that way people could gather there and they could give eulogies, and then the family would continue to the family tomb. So that was an opportunity for everyone to come and say, "I remember Mr. Cohen. Mr. Cohen was such a good man. He was so great. We're so bad that we have lost him. Our community is broken without him." And everyone would cry, and we'll see them beating their chests and all the wailing and lamenting. On a festival, nope. Straight to the funeral, straight to the cemetery. All right, we don't stop for eulogies. Keep going.
The bier of women is never set down on the throughway, even if it's not a festival, for the sake of propriety.
So the concern here was that because the body was just lying there under the cloth, that if the wind blew, if there was any shaking or moving, that it could be more embarrassing, exposing. And so for the women, we didn't do that at all. Doesn't mean we didn't tell the stories of how righteous and good they were. It just meant we didn't put them on public display as their body was. Never. Not just not during a festival, but never at all. Onward.
Women may raise a wail during the festival, but not clap their hands in grief.
Right, so these are technical types of crying.
Things people used to do.
People still do, right? Not necessarily so much in our community,
No.
but in many parts of the world, you will hear people absolutely, give a wail, a cry,
Yeah, this.
So the clapping there is, like that, or
Oh.
right, clapping to make a sound of pain, not clapping like,
Oh.
right. This wasn't approval clapping. This was a painful clapping. A sound of it's just torment. So that was normal during a festival. No.
Rabbi Ishmael says, those who are close to the bier clap their hands in grief.
Right. He said, look, if they're right up next to it, that's the people who are going to be the most mournful. You can't stop them from showing these signs of grief. Right? It's just natural within that culture. How much time do we have? Yes, we're good. We can do 9 and we're done. Yeah.
On Rosh Chodesh, on Chanukah, and on Purim, they may wail and clap their hands in grief.
Right. Rosh Chodesh, Hanukkah, Purim, these are lesser holidays.
Right.
Therefore, the prohibition is also lesser.
Neither on the former nor on the latter occasions may they offer lamentation.
All right, so lamentation again is another form of eulogizing, of giving up a speech in order to say how sad everyone should be because of this person's death.
But they don't do it on Rosh Chodesh or Purim or Hanukkah? Is that
Nope.
Latter occasion, okay. After the dead has been buried, they neither wail nor clap their hands in grief.
Right, because once the person is dead, once the person is buried, on a festival, they have to shut up. Right, they're supposed to dial down their grief. Right, when their dead is in front of them, we can't stop them completely. Once the burial has happened, dial it down. Right, on a regular day, yeah, cry and wail and all of this. Now, finish it off and then we'll talk technical.
And what is meant by wailing? When all wail in unison. What is meant by a lament? When one speaks and all respond after her, as it is said, and teach your daughters wailing and one another each lamentation.
All right, so as you may notice, lots of feminine verbs here.
Yes.
Right, this wailing and lamenting was considered to be primarily a formal job of the women of the family. Right, this is not talking about someone who's crying. This is not talking about someone who says, "Oh, Uncle Cohen, Uncle Cohen." Right, no, this is talking about organized, orchestrated, not professional, but practiced. Right, practiced grief showing. Right, this was what people would do to show their grief. The same way that we have songs for happy birthday, they had wailing traditions for how you showed that you were sad. And some of them were done everybody together, and some of them were done, yeah, oh, back and forth as a call and response, but with crying sounds, with sounds of grief. And that was done. All right. And just because we have been talking about death and it's really miserable and very painful and tragic, the sages did not want us to finish there. So we have one additional piece.
But as to the future, it says, he will destroy death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away the tears from all faces.
All right. So we didn't want to finish on a total downer. Death will eventually go away. Okay. So briefly, what of this is still relevant? Well, all of it is still relevant. And in some communities, indeed, there is not a eulogy. There is no El Malei Rachamim. Other sections of the service are also removed or replaced. During holidays, during Purim, during Hanukkah, and during Rosh Chodesh. Right? So in some communities, you will not get a eulogy if the person is being buried on Rosh Chodesh. Just silence, right? Because not allowed. The Rabbinic Assembly and the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards, yeah, I remember the acronym, has said that because for the modern world, there are very few other traditional forms of mourning that many of our congregants will experience, we will allow them to have these symbols of mourning. Much like the idea of clapping if you're closest to the funeral bier is, for so many of our congregants, they don't have the other aspects of mourning. And if we take away El Malei, if we take away the Psalms, if we take away a eulogy, then how else will they express themselves for their grief? They lack the whole orchestra of Jewish grief. Plus, our eulogies in particular don't do the same job that ancient eulogies used to do, right? Most eulogies that people give today are not designed to make people cry. Most people, when they give a eulogy, they talk about how wonderful the person was and how nice they were, and they talk about the good memories and the impact this person had on their life. The old eulogies were specifically designed to make you absolutely break down in grief. And that was the purpose of the eulogy, right? If you finished your eulogy and people weren't crying, you failed. Absolutely, just totally blew it. And everybody should be crying, not just the immediate family. You should be getting everyone to cry. And you wouldn't do that just about the person. You would talk about death and the misery of human existence and woe are all of us, and pain, torture, torment, valley of shadow. I mean, it was a real downer.
Reunion of Ashkenazi.
And most of our eulogies today don't do that, right? Most of our eulogies, in my opinion, do not qualify as really being a hesped in the traditional sense, right? They are more of a send-off, more of a celebration of life. Now, I think too often many people err on the side of being too happy at funerals, and I wish people were a little bit sadder because they don't allow themselves to feel the sadness enough, in my opinion. But it's true that we don't deliberately try to poke sadness and stir it up even more at most of our funerals. So yes, most of the Rabbinic Assembly and the conservative movement will go ahead and do these other forms. Now, Shiva and other things, absolutely. If someone passes away right before Chag, Shiva is truncated. If somebody is done with Shiva and Shloshim is ended. If somebody is buried during Chol HaMoed, we don't have a formal Shiva process for people. If people want to get together, that's their choice, but we don't announce it as a Shiva. You'll notice in our emails and communication for the congregation, we do still follow the official designations of how this is meant to be handled. So there is some moderation, and as you can see, between the Mishnah and the Gemara and the Middle Ages, there was also change of how they handled their services. So it is only natural and reasonable that we also make sure that our mourning practices still work for our community as well.
And my experience tells me that Hanukkah does not count as Chol HaMoed. Hanukkah, during Hanukkah, you have Shiva, you have all of that. Yes. No.
So you have some more than others. So you definitely still have Shiva, right, and all of that.
Yes.
But for example, the lamentation and the grief kind of things, you don't do officially. You would not do a eulogy. Officially, you would not do El Malei Rachamim and other portions of the funeral service during Hanukkah.
My father, my mother, and my husband's father all died during Hanukkah in different years.
And as you can see,
all of them.
As you can see,
I like Hanukkah candles and yurtzeit candles.
In contemporary communities,
yes, most
communities recognize that stripping all of the traditional actions of grief away from Hanukkah doesn't work for most families.
That's right.
And so most communities do allow those forms of grief during that time.
And thank God. When I heard people come to the house of Shiva after my father died, and they were talking about the baseball game that just happened and what the kids were doing in school, I realized the world was continuing.
Yeah.
The world would go on. Remember, I thought it said the sun wouldn't come. The sun came up next season. I realized, and that was actually more comforting to me than if they just sat and talked to me about my father and the sad things and all the other things.
Right.
Realizing that the world would actually go on, that I would get through to the point was very beautiful. But the idea of everybody coming, even during Hanukkah, I'm glad that that was not annulled during Hanukkah.
So during Purim that you are in Shiva, you have the mitzvah of Kriyat Megillah, but you cannot do the Kriyat Megillah because you are in Shiva. How do you do that?
Well, no, you can still come and hear the mitzvah of the Megillah, or you can also read the Megillah on your own, right? I mean, it's best the Rabbim in the community, but if you are uncomfortable or unwilling, you can still have to read the Megillah.
And what about the happiness of Purim?
It's going to be diminished, right? But that doesn't mean you can't do the mitzvot of Purim, right? You can still do shlach manot and other things as well. So yes, it's not going to be as much fun as usual, but that doesn't mean that you can't do the actual mitzvot. You know, should the poor not get their gifts from you because you're sad? You know, you still have to do matanot l'evyonim. It's still a mitzvah.
Tomorrow is Rosh Chodesh. What about Rosh Chodesh?
Tonight's Rosh Chodesh.
Yeah, it started. Yeah.
Yes.
So what happened in relation to that?
It's the same. It's the same. Yeah, I mean that's.
So Rosh Chodesh is considered like Shabbat or like Holiday?
No, Rosh Chodesh was considered a day when you wouldn't do a eulogy, you wouldn't do El Malay for the funeral.
Yeah.
You would still have the regular Shiva and everything else around it. So it was in between. So we didn't do as much during the service, but we still did. It didn't stop the Shloshim Shiva. They kept going as normal. Yeah. So if someone was already in Shiva, they would still be in Shiva tonight, tomorrow, and the next day. That's what? Thursday? Friday. Okay. Okay. I know we went a little bit longer than usual, but I wanted to go ahead and finish up because there was only a few more Mishnayot left. And as I said, there would be practical implications.
So what's next?
So what's next? Hold on a second. Let me hit the mouse and then I'll let you know.